What's up, sports fans? This is the Lucas Ross Sports Channel. We continue with our 2025 college football schedule preview and very early projected record series. The Iowa State Cyclones are up next. Before we look ahead to 2025, let's take a look back at what Iowa State did in 2024. Here are my projections and predictions last year for Iowa State. My projection for this team was 7-5, and then my prediction for them was 8-4. So I was kind of right there with Iowa State as a consistent program in the Big 12. I mean, they're usually consistent as a program and also consistent to make it to a bowl game every year. But yeah, their projection was 7-5 and 8-4, but this team did much more better than that compared to my projection and predictions last year. This team going 10-2 last year in the regular season, and they also made it to the Big 12 championship, but they got blown out by Arizona State. Yeah, it was not a great Big 12 championship performance, but they were able to win 11 games. They won 11 games if you count their bowl game victory against Miami in the Pop-Tarts Bowl. So at 11-3 season last year for Iowa State, it was a great year for the Cyclones. Let's now look back at the schedule here for 2024. And again, they were 10-2. And looking at this schedule last year, first off, you look at who they played in the non-conference. They played North Dakota, a pretty good FCS team. They beat them. Then they played on the road at Iowa, of course, and they won that game. And usually it seems like in that rivalry between the Cyclones and the Hawkeyes, it seems like the away team always wins that game. And that's exactly what happened last year and the year before. Remember, the Hawkeyes won on the road at Iowa State, and then last year, of course, Iowa State got revenge on them, and they won on the road as well. So it just seems like the away team just wins that game every year. But yeah, they beat them on the road, and then they played Arkansas State, so not a tough non-conference schedule whatsoever. Then you look at who they played in the Big 12 last year. First off, we'll start with their home schedule. They played Baylor, UCF, Texas Tech, Cincinnati, and Kansas State, so they had 5 home games last year in the Big 12. Then on the road, they played Houston, West Virginia, and also Kansas, and then also Utah. So they had to play 4 road games in the Big 12 last year. Houston wasn't really good. Kansas, was kind of a disappointing team. Texas Tech, obviously, they lost that game at home. That was probably a tough loss there, to be honest, because they were undefeated at that point. But yeah, Utah on the road, we kind of considered that in the offseason. That was going to be a very tough place to play. But yeah, Utah ended up not being as good as we thought they were going to be. And again, a lot of the teams in the Big 12 last year were not really good as we were expecting them to be. And then Iowa State and BYU and Arizona State were definitely those surprise teams in 2024. But that's the schedule from last year. Let's now look ahead to 2025. This is the schedule coming up for Iowa State heading into the 2025 season. And before we go game by game, let's take a look at who the Cyclones play in the non-conference for this season. So this is their non-conference schedule. They will play South Dakota out of the FCS, of course. They played North Dakota last year, but this time they will play South Dakota, not South Dakota State. But South Dakota is a pretty good team in the FCS, so that might not be a game where the Cyclones probably will, score a lot of points in that game. But either way, that's a game that Iowa State should be favored nonetheless. And then they, of course, play Iowa in the rivalry game. That game, of course, will be at home this time, so that's kind of favorable there for the Cyclones. But like I said, it seems like the away team always wins this game almost every single year. I mean, it's just going back and forth like that. So yeah, they'll play Iowa at home, and then they play on the road at Arkansas State. So last year they played Arkansas State at home, but this time they will play them on the road. But all in all, this is not a tough non-conference schedule for Iowa State. Let's now go on to the home Big 12 schedule for 2025. They'll play 4 home games in the Big 12 this year. They'll play Arizona, BYU, Arizona State, and Kansas. So this is not a bad home schedule. You like to have BYU and Arizona State at home this year. Those were like 2 of the, close to being like the top contenders in the Big 12, along with Iowa State. These teams right here, Iowa State, BYU, and Arizona State, and Colorado, if you count them as well, they were probably the top contenders from last year in the Big 12. So yeah, you like to have BYU and Arizona State at home, which I think is really good news. And then you got Arizona and then Kansas. You get Kansas at home, a team that you lost to last year. So that'll be a revenge game coming up there for the Cyclones for 2025. So that's your home schedule. Let's now move on to the away schedule for 2025. So as you guys already can tell, Kansas State is not a road game, but that's in a different country, so they are traveling. So that's kind of like pretty much, counted as an away game, but it's not really an away game for both teams. But yeah, Kansas State, that's going to be the game in Dublin, Ireland this year. But you look at their true road games in the Big 12, they'll play Cincinnati, Colorado, TCU, and Oklahoma State. Some pretty tough road games with Colorado, TCU, and Oklahoma State. Oklahoma State wasn't really good last year. But with Mike Gundy, it could probably turn things around in 2025. TCU will be pretty tough. They're always kind of tough in the Big 12. And then Colorado, that could be a pretty tough place to play as well. But yeah, Cincinnati is a pretty winnable game. But like I said with Kansas State, that's not really a road game. It's on a neutral site field in Dublin, Ireland. But it is counted as a road game just based off of that neutral site game. So that's your away schedule. Let's now go back to the schedule here and go full game by game now for the Cyclones. Again, they'll start things off with a Big 12 game against Kansas State on August 23rd. This will be a Week 0 game, and that game will, of course, be in Dublin, Ireland. Last year was Florida State and Georgia Tech. This time it will be two Big 12 teams hosting the Dublin, Ireland game. We're kind of usually used to seeing both teams play in the last game of the regular season, but they are now playing here in Week 0, which is kind of weird to be honest, but either way, this should be a pretty exciting game to kick off the season, especially when you kick off with a conference game for 2025. After that, they'll play South Dakota on August 30th, and then there's that rivalry game against Iowa on September the 6th. Then they go on the road to play Arkansas State on September 13th. Their first bye week comes right before playing Arizona on September 27th. That'll be a home game there for the Cyclones. Then they go on the road to play Cincinnati on October 4th. Then you go on the road again to play Colorado this time on October 11th. So they got back-to-back road games with Cincinnati and Colorado. Cincinnati probably could be a trap game, but Colorado definitely going to be a pretty tough game to play on the road. But either way, all games in the Big 12 are pretty winnable. I've been mentioning this so far for the Big 12 teams for 2025 for these projections. Every single game in the Big 12 is pretty winnable, to be honest, just of how competitive this conference is. But then their second bye week comes right before playing BYU at home on October 25th. Then they play Arizona State after that, also at home on November 1st. Then they go on the road to play TCU on November 8th. Then their third bye week comes right before playing Kansas. That'll be a revenge game there for the Cyclones. So I guess this is how it works in college football. Whoever has a Week 0 game to kick off the year, I guess that means they get 3 bye weeks. So yeah, the Cyclones get 3 bye weeks. And then they close things out here on November 29th on the road at Oklahoma State. So that's your schedule for 2025 for the Cyclones. Let's now get a projection here for this team based on how tough this schedule is. This is the scale I'll be using here for their projection. If it's a 1% game in the red, that's counted as an automatic loss in that percentage, and then your 20% games in the orange. Those are games where Iowa State will be about a couple of touchdowns of underdogs by 10 to 14 points, somewhere in that particular range. Your 40% games in the yellow, those are games where Iowa State will be a clear underdog by about a touchdown, 6, 7, 8 points, somewhere in that range. Then your 50-50 games will stay in the white, games that really can go either way. Then your 60% games in the purple, those are games where Iowa State will be favored by about a touchdown, 6, 7, 8 points. And then your 80% games in the blue, those are games where Iowa State will be favored by a couple of touchdowns by 10 to 14 points. And then your 99% games in the green are pretty much your automatic wins. So that's the percentage I'm going to start here first for this Iowa State team for their projection. So we'll start with this percentage here first. The games in the green that are counted as automatic wins, I got a couple of them, South Dakota and Arkansas State on the road. Again, I think you can make an argument that South Dakota probably should be in the blue. That game is probably closer to that 90% mark instead of over 95%, just because of how good South Dakota is at the FCS level. But I think either way, Iowa State definitely should be able to take care of business in that game. And then Arkansas State, I get it, it's on the road, it should be in the blue as well, but Iowa State is clearly the better team. They definitely should be able to take care of business in this game as well. These two games are not really guaranteed wins, but we're counting them as wins here in this projection for 2025. But yeah, South Dakota, that's probably a game at that 90% mark, like the 90 to 94% mark. And then, of course, Arkansas State. I think that's a game at least over 95%. Even though it's on the road, it could be that 90% mark as well. But these two games, we count them as wins. I don't have any blue games, I believe, or actually I do have some blue games actually on here for Iowa State. So we'll start with those blue games here, the games where I think Iowa State will be favored by a couple of touchdowns, 10 to 14 points, somewhere in that particular range. And I do got a couple of them as well. Arizona and Kansas. Arizona was not really good last year. Iowa State playing at home should be probably double-digit favorites. And look, I know the Jayhawks beat the Cyclones last year. It should be a game in the purple, but Kansas actually was kind of a disappointing team, so we don't really know how good this team is going to be. Maybe they turn things around this year. You never know about the Jayhawks. I mean, they're probably coming, that consistent program in the Big 12 where they just have a really bad year. And then the next year they probably turn things around, just like Oklahoma State does. But yeah, Oklahoma State wasn't really good last year either, but they can probably turn things around. You never know about Mike Gundy. And sometimes these Big 12 coaches, they can turn things around. But yeah, these two games, I think Iowa State will be favored in both of them by at least by double digits, 10 to 14 points. They're both playing at home in these games. So yeah, we also count these games as wins as well. And just like the green games are not really counted as guaranteed wins, but they're counted as wins here in this projection for 2025. Let's now go to the purple games where I think Iowa State will be favored by 6, 7, 8 points. So by about a touchdown, somewhere in that particular range. Now I got a couple of them as well. Cincinnati and Oklahoma State. These are two games that are on the road. That's the reason why they're both in the purple. I don't know how good Cincinnati is going to be this year. I mean, Scott Satterfield just really hasn't been able to get things done down there for the Bearcats, and Cincinnati really hasn't been the same team since they left the American Athletic Conference. But playing on the road, that's the reason why it's in the purple. And then Oklahoma State, same thing. I think, Oklahoma State can probably turn things around this year. Mike Gundy's a really good coach. This is a really well-coached Cowboys team, but they do lose some really two top players from last year, including their starting quarterback and Alan Bowman, and then they also got, Ollie Gordon is gone as well. So yeah, those two games won't be really easy just because they're both on the road. But I think Iowa State will still be favored in both of those games by 6, 7, 8 points. And I do have Iowa State a tier above these two teams just based off of how the teams finished from last year. But yeah, Iowa State, I think they'll be favored just because they're both on the road. That's the reason why they're both in the purple. So I think they'll be favored by 6 or 7 or 8 points, somewhere in that particular range. And then I got 6 50-50 games on here for the Cyclones. Kansas State in Ireland, that's a pretty tough one to predict as of right now. That could be a pretty even matchup, and that's the beginning of the season, so we don't really know how good these teams are until we get into the month of October. Then you got rivalry with Iowa here on September 6th. Of course, that's always a 50-50 game in my opinion. Like I said about this rivalry, it seems like the away team always wins it every year. And then Colorado, BYU, and Arizona State and TCU, these are all pretty even matchups in my opinion in the Big 12. And then same thing for Kansas State as well. These are all just pretty even matchups. And like I said, I think all the Big 12 teams are just so pretty even, and a lot of these teams are just going to beat up on each other like they did from last year. So what's the projected record come out to be here for Iowa State based on how tough this schedule is? Well, we count the green games as wins, the blue games as wins, and then you average out these two purple games at 60%, average out the 50-50 games at 50%, and you got a total of 6 50-50 games. So let's say they split these games. They win 3 out of the 6 games, and then you lose 3 out of the 6 games as well. That's going to give you 3 losses, and that does give you a projection of 9-3. So out of all the Big 12 teams I've done so far, these projections have come out to be a record of 9-3. Again, the Big 12 is just so hard to project right now, and then also to predict in this conference. I just don't know if a Big 12 team can win 10 games this year. It is just too early to kind of tell what these Big 12 teams are going to look like, but you never know. I mean, we saw that last year. A lot of Big 12 teams got over 10 wins, so yeah, anything can happen here in this conference. Anybody can win it, but yeah, the projection is 9-3 just based off of this schedule here for the Cyclones. 8-4 probably the worst case scenario, and then 10-2 like they did from last year. That's probably the best case scenario. So you guys agree or disagree? Let me know down in the comments below. And what do you think about Iowa State's schedule? Is it tough or not so tough? Thanks for watching this video, and stay tuned for more sports content videos on my Lucas Ross Sports YouTube channel.